What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It's Thursday, December 28th, 2017. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. Sure happy it's Thursday. If I sound a little winded, it's because I had to take Claire to the doctor's again this morning and was racing back, and we got everything connected just as the opening music was playing. And closer than that, I do not care to be shaved ever again. So anyway, we're live. We're on the air. Our third hour guest today is Donald Jeffries. He's written a book, Survival of the Richest, and we'll be talking to him about what he says in his book and how the society is basically being bought by the rich and biased to make them richer than they already are. We have a lot of other stuff to talk about as well today. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. This is our next to the last show for the year 2017, and so again, I would love to get some phone calls from people about what they think was good about this year, what they think was bad about this year, what they hope for the next year. Basically, this is our little look back moment at what has been going on this last year, and there's been some good, some bad. We'll be talking about that as well. Okay, over in Alabama, the Alabama Secretary of State is planning on certifying the election for Democrat Doug Jones today. In fact, may have already happened, but Roy Moore is suing, claiming that there is evidence of voter fraud, election fraud, of which we know there was. And so they're still out there trying to say, well, he's an accused child molester. Well, a lot of people get accused of a lot of things. Doesn't mean they did it. But they're even still now trying to do this desperation of demonizing him to quiet down that issue of election fraud, because that is the biggest of the big lies. If the American people really wake up to just how fraudulent our elections are, and last year was an eye-opener for most Americans, then the whole charade begins to fall apart. We don't have any democracy here. The leaders of our republic are not chosen democratically, which is the way the system was set on up. We're living in a dictatorship where what you, the American people, want is completely irrelevant. And I think nothing illustrates that better than the video and photos that came out of Los Angeles. Welcome to Skid Row 2017. Apparently that got picked up. It's gone viral all around the net. People are looking at that and realizing we don't have a working economy in this country when we have that many homeless people. And our government places the incoming illegal immigrants and the refugees as a higher priority than American citizens who've been born here and lived all their life here. Because there's all kinds of assistance to help refugees and illegal immigrants get into our functioning system as much as it functions, and there's nothing there. There's no mechanism to help Americans who've fallen out the bottom climb back up and start all over again. It just is not there. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a phone call. Kevin in West Virginia, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mr. Mike. A few days ago, you were talking about 2017 in review and
Yes.
looking back. I have a couple news stories that I think are pretty profound. The first one is the JFK release of the JFK files, and the reason why I find it to be very, very profound is it shows their tactics. The same tactics that they were doing back in the 60s are the same tactics, like with Mockingbird, that they're doing today.
Yes. The difference is today they don't work anymore. Back in the 1960s, the American people were very trusting of the corporate media and the government. They were very naive. They thought that when some politician was caught lying or the media made a mistake, that it was a unique occurrence. Today, it's very different. The American people understand the sheer scale of the lying in which we're all subject to by our politicians and by the corporate media.
Absolutely. The second story that I thought was very, very, very interesting, and I have a whole different take on this than most people, and that is the releasing of the black projects of the Pentagon. And the reason why I think this is because it proves my point that we can stop being addicted to oil with these alternative energies, and we can throw the shackles off the oligarchs and not only be true Americans, but be true world citizens too. I mean, if we can throw big energy off and being, under control of petro, I think we would be making leaps and bounds to being free.
Well, I disagree with you, because in a world that needs artificially created or generated energy, it doesn't matter if it's big oil or big wind or big solar or big nuclear. You're just changing one set of masters for another, unless we can come to a situation where every individual home is providing its own energy needs. And that's going to be a combination of new energy harvesting technologies like more efficient solar cells, coupled with lower actual demand for energy. But as long as you have an organized society, you're going to have those individuals who will spend their entire lives getting their hands on, shall we say, the master control valve of that society in order to keep us all under their control. Now, the reason I'm in agreement that we ought to reduce our dependence on oil and gas is there's only so much of it out there. And even with the awareness now that petroleum is created by deep crust microbes, they can't create new petroleum products to keep up with how fast we're burning it up. And so there does need to be something else out there. Unfortunately, all of the green projects that we saw come out of Al Gore and the human-caused global warming movement turned out to be boondoggles, like the Solyndra solar cell disaster, windmills that don't work. There's a long way to go. But unfortunately, everybody's trying to find technologies that will plug into the existing infrastructure so that they can maintain ownership and control.
Totally understand your point, absolutely. And that's why I think this is needed, the discourse, with other people calling in and, and getting ideas out there. We can always agree to disagree, and I think that's awesome. And that's one thing in colleges that we don't have, and I'm so against the lectures, that we need to have dialogue. And I wish there was more of it.
Well, I'm in agreement on that, and what amazes me, because when I went to college, it was supposed to be a place where you explored new ideas and alternative ways of thinking about the nation, the government, the infrastructure, how things got done. And today, colleges and universities have become the most rigid enforcers of the existing liberal status quo, and they have become incredibly intolerant of anybody who's got a different idea other than what is being constantly regurgitated out of the liberal establishment.
Yeah, totally. I mean, where I go to school, I live in West Virginia, and I go to Hagerstown, Maryland, Hagerstown Community College. If somebody gets triggered, you can go and block off a half-an-hour block of time to go and pop bubble wrap. Give me a break.
Absolutely. The kids who are coming out of these universities, they're not equipped to deal with the real world, either in terms of being able to do a job, if one is out there to be done, or to deal with the adversity that one encounters as just a normal part of everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's all I have for you, Mr. Mike, and I want to say this to you, and I mean this with the bottom of my heart. Thank you for stepping up to the plate and doing what you're doing with all the ridicule and everything. You are a true hero and a true patriot. And I love you and Claire, and you guys are awesome.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words, and have a happy new year. We're going to switch on over to Ken in Fort Worth now. Ken, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Hey, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram reporting today that Canada Railway can order 200 freight engines from General Electric to be built here in Fort Worth. Evidently, Trump opened up ANWR for oil drilling, and they need rail to get up there, and they have to have rail to haul the oil out. So that's what it's looking like.
Trump is really pumping up the domestic production, and some of that is good because it does make us less dependent on the Middle East, which is headed obviously into turmoil that could disrupt oil flow, oil prices. The downside is that they're revoking a lot of safety and monitoring regulations that were put into place following the Deepwater Horizon disaster, and I do not agree with that, because anytime you stop watching what these large industries are doing, they'll start cutting corners to make a fast buck, to improve their profitability, and sooner or later they cross that line and they make a decision that leads to a disaster like the Deepwater Horizon.
Yeah. Hey, you got to call a little city up there, Trumpville. How does that sound?
Probably. He would be very flattered by it. And
you're going to have to build a town up there to have people who work there, and they got to take kids up there to school, and it's going to be quite a thing to watch do it.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be a boom town for a while, no question about that. But then if you've ever watched the TV show Ice Road Truckers, a lot of that centers on oil development exploration up there.
and it's not easy to get up there either.
No, it isn't, but I imagine, between the trucks, between the new rail lines, and I'm sure they'll be investing in cold weather aircraft and airports. They may even contract with Russia, which is producing nuclear-powered icebreakers. The Russians know how to build cold weather shipping.
How far is that from the ocean?
How far is which from the ocean?
Anwar, how far is that from an ocean?
I don't exactly know, but I know that Trump is opening up some of the offshore areas for Alaska for exploration as well. So they're going to have some shoreline facilities.
Yeah. Hey, nice talking to you guys.
All right, thanks an awful lot. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. And we're going to switch on over to Dustin in New Jersey. Dustin, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, Mike, who's going to pay for all the cleanup operations when it goes wrong, just like that pipeline over by the Indian reservation? Yeah, that's the problem with these things, man.
It'll get dumped on the taxpayer. That's what always happens. Ultimately, the taxpayers picked up most of the cost of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. British Petroleum did pay a fine, but they just take that off their taxes, and so the load shifts back to ordinary people again.
Wasn't British Petroleum also in, was it Amazon with the rubber plants or rubber trees, right? Didn't they contaminate that river too?
Yes, they did. They did.
Yeah, see? Yep. Hey, Mike, I don't know if you watch, like, Tucker Carlson or listen to any of the radio shows. There's that British guy, he fills in for Sean Hannity sometimes. They push this false narrative where Trump comes in and he wiped out 98% of ISIS. 98%. That is the biggest lie, like, ever. Because ISIS was expanding until the Russians came in. I'm sorry to break it to people.
Yes.
The Russians came in and pushed the ISIS and the moderate head chopper rebels away from Syria, basically, because Syria was like a stopgap. And it seems like what the U.S. was doing is using obviously using it as a proxy army, but maneuvering them, kind of guiding them into certain areas, and they would use them and it would keep them in certain areas. But I mean, it was the Russians that Trump didn't do anything. That's why you don't even see any videos of airstrikes coming out from the Americans in how long against ISIS. Yeah,
the U.S. is trying to take credit for Russia's accomplishment in Syria. Because the U.S. doesn't want to admit that, at least up until now, their agenda to replace Bashar al-Assad has failed utterly. And you're absolutely right. The U.S. Was using ISIS and al-Qaeda, arming them, training them, still doing it apparently. More about that later. And now that this has absolutely gone wrong from the U.S. Point of view, the U.S. agenda, they're trying to convince the American people that somehow we've won a tremendous victory in Syria, when in point of fact we got shown the door.
But if you notice, they're not even talking about Syria anymore. They didn't talk about Syria having their Christmas, or anything. RT was the only one, which is on, the U.S. government's special favorite list. But what a joke. I mean, Sean Hannity and all, and I really don't like Sean Hannity. I never liked him and Ollie North. Tucker Carlson's okay. I mean, they all still read off the script. That's what people just don't understand. They still have their talking points. So they got to stick with a script. Tucker Carlson might, have his own version of it, but they still all stick to that script like MSNBC or CNN. So you never trust these media outlets. You got to do your own research, people.
Absolutely.
Don't trust Trump. Don't trust me. Do your own research. I mean, that's the best way. Be your own man. Be a critical thinking person. I mean, it's not hard to figure out what's going on if you just spent 10 minutes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Hey, Mike, on that kid who called, I don't know, I forgot his name. I came in on the college campuses. I mean, you got to realize it's a cult, man. It's a cult that it doesn't matter what you say to them or do or anything. They follow a certain religion. And you'll never change them, just like Jamestown and all this other cult groups. It's a cult of global liberalism. And it's worldwide.
Yes, it is.
It's worldwide.
Yes, it is. And unfortunately, our colleges and universities are not educating young people; they're indoctrinating them to this liberal agenda.
And then, Mike, my last point before I get off the phone is on North Korea. I know some people are worried that called in about us. We're not going to attack North Korea.
I hope you're right.
This is about weapons. Yeah, it's about weapon sales, Mike. That's what it's about. And it's trying to get South Korea to buy more weapons and be their own. Listen, if South Korea and Japan was really scared of North Korea, they would launch a strike. But they can't because you know why? It's the unknown knowns. They don't know what North Korea's nuclear capability is, but, probably 60 nuclear warheads of some type. That's the great, that's
South
that
Korea,
will stop anybody from it.
South Korea does not want to attack North Korea. 6 years ago, they were talking about reunification like happened in Germany. South Korea's current president still believes in that policy. They call it the Sunshine Policy of reaching across that DMZ, shaking hands, and becoming one country. It's the U.S. that went on in and kept them divided to keep that Cold War Eastern version going. Just like the U.S. was really not all that happy about Germany reunifying because they wanted to keep that adversarial relationship. I mean, if you think back at how much money was looted and plundered from the American taxpayer during the Cold War of the 1950s and 1960s, it was an obscene sum of money, and it just wound up being poured into pits in the ground, missile silos, submarines, all these things that cost so much money to build and maintain, and thankfully were never used. And even they said at the time, we're never going to use these, but we just need to spend lots and lots of money on them.
Because we're a warfare and a welfare state, like we said before, like Rome. That's why we're arming the Ukraine for defensive, offensive. Both are the same. Saudi Arabia. It's about weapon sales to keep this economy partially afloat with a percentage of the economy. But Mike, do you realize, what these people think, they would try? I mean, only weapon sales can do so much.
Well, the other part of it...
If South Korea and Japan, if they don't want to attack North Korea, it's not going to happen.
Well,
they got their own populations to worry about.
You've only got half the equation. Yes, a lot of it has to do with weapon sales, but the other half of it has to do with the fact that these countries that want to buy these weapons are having to borrow the money with which to buy those weapons, and that places them back under the control of the private central bankers. So the reason they're pushing for all this war all over the place, and there's overlapping competing agendas. It's not everybody following the exact same plan here. But a big part of it is, yes, convince these countries they have to buy new weapons, convince them they have to borrow money to buy those new weapons, and then use that debt to control the nation's future.
Just like the Department of Homeland Security.
Yes.
The fear of terror creates its own monster group organization. Hey, Mike, if China's not going to allow, anyway, North Korea to be attacked, they can cut oil shipments off because North Korea's got enough oil they stored already. But it's a proxy state. Mike, do you think they're going to allow the United States to set up shop in North Korea right next to China? They remember the first Korean War when they came in, the Chinese,
yes.
And then MacArthur, wanted to use nuclear weapons on China, right?
Yes, yes.
They're not going to allow it to happen, Mike. The Russians will come in. They'll come in. The Iranians so you have a world war. So that's why I keep going back to there's not going to be no military engagement in North Korea because it would cause a world war.
Well, there are those people who think a world war would be a really good idea right now. For the same reason they thought getting into World War I and World War II was a really good idea, to distract everybody away from a crashing economy and a corrupt government. And so, yeah, there are people who think that would actually be a good idea, and it doesn't really matter because we can, the World War will be on somebody else's land. That was certainly the case in World War I, where it was fought primarily in Europe, and then in World War II, where it was fought primarily in Europe and the Pacific, and the American homeland saw very little actual conflict. And probably the promoters of World War today are thinking exactly the same thing. Isolated in the middle of the North American continent, the World War will be fought everywhere else except our country, and the United States will again emerge profitable at the end of it. We've got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And getting into the news, Trey Gowdy is out there making an observation, and he's bang on with this one. The FBI has disappointed the American people. We've all been raised with a certain expectation of what the FBI is supposed to be, what they're supposed to be doing, and we're not seeing it actually materialize. And as we start to see more and more indications that the FBI was an accessory to the cover-up of Hillary Clinton's private email server, protecting her from prosecution, possibly accessories to espionage and treason as well, the American people are looking at the FBI and wondering, just why do we have them? If their sole job is to be a 21st century American Gestapo, there to enforce the will of the tyrants, then they're obviously of no benefit to we the American people. And we have seen over the last several years how the FBI is trying to manufacture a positive public image by going on out with undercover informants and literally luring very susceptible, suggestible people into maybe thinking and talking about committing an act of terror. Then they'll swoop on down, arrest them, they'll get headlines saying FBI stops terror attack, and then 6 months down the road the judge throws the case out of court as obvious entrapment, which gets no reporting whatsoever. And so people are disappointed in the FBI. They have every right to be. My disappointment with them goes all the way back to 1994 and the murder of White House Deputy Counsel Vincent Foster. But a lot of people are out there now saying it's time, if we're going to keep the FBI, it's got to be drastically changed. And Representative Francis Rooney of Florida is saying it's time for a complete purge of all these deep state operatives from the FBI and the Department of Justice. This was in an interview on MSNBC last Tuesday. And Representative Rooney basically came on out and said he's very concerned that the Department of Justice and the FBI, whether you want to call it deep state or what, they're off the rails, meaning they're not doing the job we, the American people, think they ought to be doing. And then he went on to talk about how McCabe's wife, at the same time McCabe was supposedly part of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, McCabe's wife gets $600,000 from Clinton-related sources while she's running for state senator. That's an obvious conflict of interest. McCabe should have recused himself. He did not. Now, there was an article over in Zero Hedge, The Anatomy of Hillary Clinton's $84 million money laundering scheme. And they start out talking about a decision by the United States Supreme Court, McCutcheon versus FEC, basically saying this opened the door to this labyrinth system of using state political party chapters as straw men and cutouts to get around limitations on donations to candidates and political campaigns. And that's exactly what happened with Hillary Clinton. And even in Donna Brazil's book, she mentions, yes, that a lot of money that was aimed at Hillary Clinton's campaign was donated to the state chapters and from them immediately forwarded along. And it was understood when the money came on in. You don't spend this. You don't get to do anything with it. You send it along to the DNC and Hillary Clinton's campaign. And so basically they are guilty of money laundering to evade campaign donation limits. There should be indictments and charges on that one. And it's amazing when you really get into it, looking not just at the fact that Hillary and Bill Clinton got away with a crime here and a crime there, the sheer volume of corruption, assassination, election fraud, it's just astounding. And what does it say about the law enforcement of the United States of America that they have gotten away with it all this time? And of course, we understand on a very abstract level, the government is afraid of the Clintons. The Clintons could blow the whistle on all that CIA gun and drug running out of Arkansas in the 1980s and probably a lot of other stuff as well. Scandals that could conceivably bring down the central federal government in its current weakened state, where it's out of money, and has lost the trust of its people. It's actually in a very fragile condition, which is why I keep saying I foresee a Soviet Union-style collapse as what is going to happen to Washington, D.C. And apparently I am not the only person who is thinking this, because Ron Paul has come on out with an article saying U.S. on path to fascism, on verge of collapse. Actually, I think we're already fascistic, but I would agree with Ron Paul on the other. The U.S. government is on the verge of collapse. And Ron Paul said that the apparent economic growth under Trump is an illusion because it's all in that stock market and financial market. And he says the American political system is on the verge of coming apart, similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. This is Ron Paul saying this, not me. So apparently a lot of people are seeing the same symptoms that I am, and they're foreseeing the same outcome. We got to take another break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here, getting on back to the domestic politics here. A lot of people are looking at Donald Trump's new national security strategy. And again, one of my big disappointments for 2017 is the continuance and acceleration of the United States militarist policy towards pretty much the rest of the world. And I'll be very honest, the primary reason I supported Donald Trump last year was that I didn't want Hillary Clinton in that Oval Office. And I'm still convinced that had she won, we'd be in an even worse situation than we are right now. But this military policy has continued unabated, going all the way back to the Project for the New American Century. And it almost seems like whoever is president is no longer all that relevant in terms of the military policy, because it's still neocon thinking. Even when it was Barack Obama in the Oval Office, it was neocon thinking. And basically, the Washington foreign policy elites still look at the rest of the world as something to be conquered and brought under the control of the United States government. And I think the biggest single argument against that is taking a look at how the United States government has managed or mismanaged the United States itself. And for that very reason, I'm sure a lot of other countries around the world are saying, thanks, but no thanks. We'll run our own countries, and we'll probably do a better job of taking care of our country and our people than you do taking care of the United States and the American people. But it does seem like the neocons have never really left. They just changed which rocks they were hiding under. Let's go back to the phones. Peter in Los Angeles, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Mike, Merry Christmas to you and Claire, by the way. First time I've called since Christmas. Hey, your point about the corruption and how just absolutely rampant, and it's in every single fiber of our government.
Yes.
I would tell you that what the Clintons did is, and by the way, I think they were really shown the way in how to corrupt the government by the Israeli lobby.
Yes.
Who, you know, for years, I mean, you could kill people, and if you paid off the right people with enough money, you could sink the Liberty or attack it and wipe out, you know, all those people and so on and so forth. But the Clintons went and they corrupt everything that they touch, and any institution that they had influence over, they put people in. They brought it into the corruption web, which means that the entire government over their 8-year reign and more, with Hillary as Secretary of State, has been totally corrupted and put onto this deep state corruption thing and it's bipartisan, Mike.
Yes.
They're all in it both ways, and it is the government. It's not the corruption. It's not the deep state. It is the government.
Yes.
And Clinton corruption is the government.
Well,
so,
I don't want to. I want to give credit where credit is due, because it's not the Clinton corruption; it's the CIA corruption. Because if the CIA had not been using Arkansas as the base of their gun and drug running operations, they never would have approached Bill Clinton about coming on board with all of this. And Bill Clinton would still have been the former governor of Arkansas, and we never would have really heard all that much about Hillary. There's no question the Clintons were eager participants, but they did not initiate this cycle of corruption inside our government. That has been coming out of the CIA, and it goes way before the Clintons ever came to power, back to Vietnam when the CIA was running heroin back into the United States inside the body bags of our dead Vietnam kids. To fund covert operations not approved by the Congress or the administration.
That's a fair point, Mike. I would then let me amend mine. The Clintons took that and they completely digested it all and took it in, and it metastasized. It spread. It went viral under the Clintons. But you're right. I think you can take this back. You can take this back to the CIA. I think that is the single. It really does need to be blown up, Mike.
Yeah, it really does. John F. Kennedy tried to do it. But again, there's another factor, and that is public awareness. Because back in the Vietnam era, and the CIA was doing these kind of things, but the American people were unaware of it because the corporate media kept it hidden. Now, since the mid-1980s, with the advent of the Internet and the independent media, the American people are now aware of what the CIA and the Clintons and all these other corrupt people are doing. And so it's not so much that the degree of corruption is increasing, although I'm sure it has. It's that the public awareness is increasing right alongside it. And more people are aware of what's been going on.
And Mike, you know, for the last year has like flashed it in neon. What you have been saying for years, and informed people have known for years, that the media itself is completely, not completely, but largely CIA controlled, and also it's just an organ of the deep corrupt state.
Well, the corporate media is functioning as a one-stop propaganda center, not just for the government and the CIA, but for corporate interests, politicians. The corporate media is for sale. They will gladly sell out their integrity and the interests of the American people in exchange for sums of money. We've seen that with Monsanto and their handling of GMO. We saw that in the Fox synthetic bovine growth hormone lawsuit. That's why we call them prostitutes and correspondents, because that's really what they're doing. They take their money and they put on out propaganda on behalf of whoever's paying them, and then try and pretend like they're some kind of guardian of the public interest.
Mike, by the way, just quickly, see, I just tuned in. Have you heard any news on that little Palestinian girl, that Emmet Tamimi, or whatever her name was, that little girl who stood up when her brother got shot in the eyes?
Well, Israel's authorities are moving her around, so nobody knows where she is, and apparently her Twitter account has now been deleted.
I'm hoping, you know, she's not being raped and tortured and abused, but that's a very real possibility.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The Israelis do not see Palestinians as human beings worthy of respect.
What a courageous little girl. But, hey, Mike, listen, I'm going to let you go, but Happy New Year to you and Claire as well, and God bless you. Really glad that you're there.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. Have a Happy New Year yourself. We're going to let you go. Now, getting on into the news at the war zones, and again, emphasis on the plural, the chief of the Russian General Staff has accused the United States of hosting a new training facility for ISIS fighters in Syria along the Syria-Iraq border. This is at Al-Tanf base on Syria's southeast side, and it's been under the control of the U.S.-backed New Syria Army and their U.S. Special Forces advisors since the area was captured from ISIS in August of 2016. And Russia has previously called this base a 100-kilometer-wide black hole operated by the U.S., wherein an assortment of unaccountable armed groups and militias can operate freely. So the U.S. is still there in Syria. They've still got a base there in which they're training these ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups to try and turn the course of the war in Syria. Syria wants them gone. Russia wants them gone. All right, let's take another phone call here. Joe in Rhode Island, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Mike, the
underground or illegal drug trade throughout the world, what percentage of I believe that this drug cartel around the world is supplying the financial needs of the globalists. It's supporting all countries of the world, and I believe this is a technique that they're using. My question to you, Mike, is what percentage of this drug trade is actually financing the globalist efforts to bring in the one world system?
That's a very hard question to answer, mostly because who is in control of what part of the global drug trade is shifting constantly. We know that the CIA has a lock on Afghanistan. They would like to have a lock on North Korea. During the war in Vietnam, they had a lock on pretty much all of the heroin coming out of the Golden Triangle from Burma and Kunsa. And that money was used not to necessarily prop up the one world government, but again, to give the CIA the money with which to carry out covert operations that were not approved by Congress or by the administration. The CIA went rogue a long time ago, and I'm sure their upper levels honestly believe they know what's best for planet Earth. And they could have all kinds of different agendas going on there. We do know that illegal drug trade of any contraband is used to change the politics of the country in which it's taking place. And a good example of that, of course, is prohibition here in the United States of America, where the rum runners and bootleggers had enough money to literally reshape the government to their own interests. And once the American political system had been changed, prohibition was repealed so that new up-and-coming rum runners and bootleggers wouldn't be able to be a threat to the new established order. And a lot of dynastic political families came out of prohibition days. It's been suggested, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the Kennedy family fortune came out of rum running and bootlegging, because at the start of prohibition, old Joe Kennedy was just middle class, didn't have a lot of money, had a little money, not a lot of money, came out of prohibition incredibly wealthy, had a legal liquor business, which he then sold off to a known gangster family, and then he took his money and he ran his sons for political office, including John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy. And old Joe literally had a plan of a 24-year Kennedy dynasty in the White House.
Yeah.
So now we have new political elites.
Answer as far as a global.
Well, to complete the point I was just making, now we have a new political elite that was raised and empowered in the drug trade, and that certainly includes the Clintons.
Mm-hmm. And how powerful is that today, would you say, Mike?
Well, it's immensely powerful.
Your estimate.
And the only thing that is going to stop it is public awareness that the corruption coming out of making drugs illegal outweighs the dangers of legalization of drugs. Because once prohibition was over and alcohol was available and taxed, that corrupting influence went away. And I think ultimately the same thing is going to have to happen here. People are just going to have to say, make all these drugs legal, tax them, regulate them, and then the purveyors of these drugs won't have enough money to literally buy the government out from under the American people.
Good point, yeah. Mike, also, one other question, if I could. The New Age movement, what do you know about it?
Well, I've heard the phrase the New Age movement several times in several contexts, even going back to when I was in college. And back then it meant there was a turn of the epic, the age of Aquarius and so forth. New Age is also a music genre, so I'm not exactly sure in what context you posed that question.
Well, supposedly, I've heard from certain people that the Vatican City of the New Age movement would be Findhorn, Scotland. Does that ring a bell at all?
No, I'm afraid I'm going to have to say I'm not familiar with this particular meaning for New Age.
Okay. I'll let somebody else talk, Mike.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to switch to Ramsey in Canada. Aloha, Ramsey. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
So I just want to tell you something. Regarding 2017, I would say the main positive issue for me is when the whole U.S. Election was hacked by Russia. That turned out to be a lie.
Yes.
Because I argued with a lot of people on this issue throughout the whole year, including with people on RBN. But you said the main negative thing for me this year is the damage of the statues and the whole U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. I would say those are the main problems for me.
Well, there's no question that Donald Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel has had major repercussions around the globe, and we haven't seen the end of that yet either.
Yeah. And so one quick question I have for you. You said yesterday that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, he's against Bashar al-Assad in Syria?
Well, he's all of a sudden started talking tough about saying it's impossible to go any further with Assad. And he's not very clear in terms of what direction he thinks everybody should be going. But Turkey, unfortunately, is proving to be a loose cannon on the deck, because at one moment they seem to be more aligned with Western interests, and then all of a sudden they'll do something where they seem to be more aligned with Russia, China, and the Arab world. And I think it's reached the point where hardly anybody really wants to do business with him anymore because he's become unreliable.
Okay, thank you. Happy New Year.
All right, Happy New Year. We're going to let you go here. Now, speaking of Turkey, apparently Erdogan's attempt to pivot toward the Mideast Arab nations isn't going all that well. And Turkey and the European Union have had this ongoing friction since 2016, after Brussels expressed strong criticism of Ankara over the mass arrests in the country connected with the failed coup d'etat. However, apparently Erdogan is trying to patch up relations with the European Union and say, let's go back to talking about being friends, about having Turkey in the European Union, but so far negotiations are halted. So it may be that Europe has changed its mind about having Turkey in their bloc as well. Frankly, the European Union's got so many problems going on right now, I don't think they need any more chaos coming out of Turkey. We'll be right back after these commercials. And Aloha America, welcome back to our show here. One of the big issues we've had in 2017, and it was in 2016 as well, is this constant drumbeat of Russian aggression. Russia is aggressive. Russia's trying to expand. Russia's doing all these things. And yet it is the Western forces that are pouring troops and weapons along the border with Russia. And you're maybe wondering, how did we get into this mess? Things had calmed down. The Cold War had ended. Russia and the West were getting along fine. They were doing business together. How did it all go so wrong? And we're learning now that part of the problem is that once again the U.S. government has demonstrated this very bad habit of reaching agreements with other countries and then promptly violating them. And we're still seeing more information come on out from this recently declassified documents from the U.S., the Soviet, German, British, and French. And it's all being posted by the National Security Archive at George Washington University, in which it confirms once again that the Soviet Union went along with German reunification in exchange for a commitment from NATO that there would be no eastern expansion, that NATO would stop on that eastern border of Germany, and that was it. And obviously that is not what has happened. NATO has been trying to expand further and further into the Russian sphere of influence. So from the point of view of Russia, they're dealing yet again with promises made by NATO and the West that were not kept. And if you cannot trust other countries to keep their word, it sort of makes any kind of negotiations or discussions a waste of time. Stop listening to what they're saying and look at what they're doing. And this is a good example. Forget about all this talk about we promise we won't intrude into your territory, and look at what they're doing. Intruding into Russia's territory and sphere of influence. And certainly the now admitted U.S.-backed coup d'etat in Kiev is a perfect example of that. To take Ukraine away from merging with the Russian republics and drag them into the EU. That was the agenda. Now, apparently, the Russian Foreign Ministry is out there saying that the current situation in Ukraine violates the Minsk agreements, because the Minsk agreements said that Donbass would be granted special status within Ukraine. A nation within a nation, but with autonomy. And Kiev certainly is taking the other position that Donbass will be brought firmly under the control of Kiev. And so now Russia is saying this is going to trigger a change of policy by Russia toward the Donbass to basically keep parity. Because once again, deals that were made, in this case the Minsk agreement, have been ignored and violated. Yet another treaty which seems to be heading into the trash bin is called the Open Skies Treaty. And this was a treaty adopted in 2002 which established a program of unarmed aerial surveillance flights over the territory of the participants. More about this when we come back from station identification. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show, hour number 2. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And we're talking about yet another treaty made by the United States, which is basically being abused. And this one is called the Open Skies, the Treaty on Open Skies, adopted in 2002. This was back when Bush was in office. And basically it was a treaty among 34 different countries, and it established a program of unarmed aerial surveillance flights over each other's countries to keep an eye on military buildup. Trust but verify. Now, prior to the availability of high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft like the SR-71, such surveillance was done entirely by satellites. And back then the satellites used film, which they would take pictures and the film canister would return to Earth, which actually triggered a lot of so-called UFO sightings. But it was very costly, very expensive. It wasn't very real-time, but it was basically done by both sides, by all parties involved, to verify that each country was complying with the various treaties limiting the numbers of nuclear weapons and nuclear missile submarines. And there were certain procedures when you were working on your missiles that you would have all the hatches and everything open and everything would be visible to the sky because you knew you were being watched. There was that. Well, in the advent of robotic aircraft, surveillance aircraft, they moved to that, which is more real-time. And so in 2002, they had this treaty on open skies between 34 states in which each state was allowed to have unarmed surveillance flights flying over each other's country to make sure they were in compliance with various treaties. Unfortunately, Russia has notified the U.S. that because the U.S. Has basically been creating obstacles to the Russian Open Skies missions, that Russia is going to have to reciprocate and start blocking the U.S. flights over Russian territory. And so once again, Russia understands you can't believe or trust anything the U.S. government says. All right, let's go ahead and take a phone call. Martin in San Francisco, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Listen, I'm actually in the East Bay.
Yes.
And I've been following you since 2003 or something like that when I started reading your website. Shortly after that, I think you were on GCN on Saturdays.
Something like that, yeah. 2007 is when I started doing radio, but it feels like a long time ago now.
Really? Okay. Well, in any case, I used to listen to you on Saturdays, right? You had a show on GCN, did you, on Saturdays?
I think I did. I remember there was a Saturday show. Pardon me, a Saturday show. At one point, I was doing 2 different shows for 2 different networks, but that was just, I couldn't sustain that load.
Yeah. Anyhow, yeah, I agree with you, so much. You've really informed me on 9/11 and a bunch of other subjects, even though, I was into Gary Allen and Nundor call it conspiracy back in the late 70s. So I go back and looking at this world conspiracy of, globalism, it goes back a long time. But anyhow, the reason I called is because I do listen to you during the week a lot at work, and I don't have a chance to call in. I just listen to you on headphones while I'm at my computer, etc. And there's a couple of things that are being kind of bugging me. One is your gloom and doom on the economy, and one is your gloom and doom on World War. And I would like to think that it's more of a gloom situation on both of those. In other words, we're due for a major correction on the economy in terms of the stock market being way overvalued. But there's still a lot of domestic production here that sustains the dollar, not just the worldwide, oil trade and the like. We also have oil that's produced here, a lot of agriculture, be it GMO or what have you, and a lot of small businesses, including the one I work for, does $150 million a year in production in the United States. There's a lot of businesses like the one I work for. And, let me get your opinion on that.
Well, my opinion, first of all, is that the rest of the world does not want to buy our GMO exports. They're banned in countries like China and Russia, and other countries as well are saying they have to be labeled, and people are steering clear of that. Yes, there are businesses still running here in the United States, and the question, though, is that if you take the current shall we say, cash position of the United States economy, it's in bad situation. The U.S. owes something like $8 trillion more to foreign creditors than we have assets in this country. And that is an unsustainable debt. Now, if you look at the money that's coming in from what products we do export, what agricultural produce we do export, various services that we provide to the rest of the world, and if you subtract out the income that is generated by other countries using the U.S. Federal Reserve note, the situation goes from just barely being able to get by to being unsupportable. And that's why I and a lot of other economic experts are very pessimistic about the future of the economy. The debt is completely out of control. The wealth inequality is out of control. We know that we've got something like 100 million legal American citizens who've been unable to find jobs for months, if not years. And again, go back and look at that video of Skid Row 2017 in Los Angeles, and that is a real Buddha on the road moment. So you can't look at any of this and say that this economy is functioning anywhere close to what would be considered normal and healthy. It is an economy that is basically in decline. Those with money are trying to hang on to their money and grab what's left out of everybody else's pockets. We've gone from a nation in which we have the majority of people producing articles for sale, and to a nation where pretty much everybody is peeking under each other's couch cushions looking for spare change. And that's not a functioning economy.
Well, I don't think that. I agree that we are due for a correction, and that there is not nearly the rosy situation that the government likes to portray. But I think that there's a lot of production in this country that will sustain us through a major correction from going into a total collapse, which is what I mean about gloom but no doom.
Oh, okay. I see what you're coming about. Well, we saw the same thing during the 1930s, where as large factories would close, they were replaced by small entrepreneurial operations. The big issue, though, is that if all the tangible assets like the land are in the hands of the bankers, then the American people, no matter how productive they are not going to be able to basically buy a better life for themselves, no matter how hard they work at it. Now, coming out of World War II, the reason it was a golden age for the American people was that the United States was the only country whose industrial base had not been bombed into rubble. And therefore, any company in the United States that made machine tools, ball bearings, anything like that, they were selling to the rest of the world as the rest of the world rebuilt their factories. And that was one of the reasons for the post-war the baby boom times, along with, of course, the Bretton Woods Agreement, which had the United States Federal Reserve serving as the issuing authority for the monetary instruments used by other countries across border. And there was a big profit being made with that as well. But they ran that one as long as they could until Nixon's shock. But our economy has been more illusion than functionality ever since then. We know the stock market is being manipulated. The various indicators are being fudged, like the unemployment numbers. And if you're doing that much fakery to make the economy look good, that right there tells you that the true state of our economy is pretty much deplorable. Now, right now, the big retailers are out there singing the songs about all the billions and billions of dollars in business they did for the holiday shopping season, which sounds really good until you remember that the vast majority of that was all done on credit. And that, to me, is actually a bad sign rather than a good sign.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. We are definitely due for a correction. I would agree there.
Yes.
But I do believe that it won't be a complete collapse. We have more going for us than the Soviet Union did when they collapsed.
Well, I'm afraid I don't see it that way. I see the United States government as having made pretty much all the same mistakes, way too much spending on the military to the expense of other areas of economic development. But what brought down the Soviet Union was less the economic realities of the country than the fact that the Soviet citizens simply lost all trust and confidence in that central government. And they just stopped listening, they stopped obeying, and at that point the government couldn't function. And I think we're coming up on something similar here in the United States.
Would be a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
I agree.
The other point, just real quickly, on the gloom scenario that you portray about a world war with atomic bombs being used, I find that a little bit of a stretch. What we've seen since World War II, since the dropping of the atomic bomb, has been a new paradigm of world wars where they're all regional and controlled and not aimed at other nuclear powers. And I believe that's probably the way we will continue. I don't like that, but I don't think that that the power elite, that even the 1% of the 1%, want a real nuclear war. And the reason is that their lifestyles and their overall well-being is dependent on way more worker bees, way more agriculture, foreign ski resorts, all these things that would be affected in their lavish lifestyle if they had to go into some sort of underground bunker situation.
Well, I understand that, but on the other hand, you've got people who would be willing to go into that underground bunker situation for 6 months or so, knowing that when they came on out, there'd be a lot more room on the planet. The danger here are people who think nuclear war is going to be survivable. Now, if you look at the nuclear weapons that are ready to go right now today, they make the bombs the United States dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like New Year's poppers in comparison. Those bombs that went off over Japan were very, very small weapons compared to what is out there today. And again, we're not talking about necessarily bombing the entire surface of planet Earth, but bombing enough of it to cause global commerce to collapse, triggering a new dark ages. There's the issue of nuclear winter coming on top of what appears to be a new modern minimum. So would it exterminate all human life? No. Would it take civilization back down to a much more primitive level? Absolutely. And we could find ourselves literally blowing ourselves into a new dark ages.
So do you really think that the elite, the people that really have more control over this planet than you or, than the common government people do you think that they really aren't aware of all that?
I'm sure that the rational people among them are aware of that, but then you get these fanatics who are just caught up with this apocalyptic vision of the United States ridding the world of Russia and China all at once. Just because somebody is in a position of extreme wealth and power doesn't necessarily mean that they're sane and rational. In fact, if a recent experience is going to teach us anything, it's that people who have that kind of money and power think that the normal rules don't apply to them, and they're willing to take these chances. Look how close we came to a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. All it takes is one hothead to turn that first key, and then everybody piles on board.
Oh, yeah, that kind of thing could happen. I'm talking about a calculated move done by the very elite of the world, the elite globalists of the world, to actually start a nuclear war between the Soviet Union or China and the United States.
Well, let me give you another scenario, and I'm borrowing from Tom Clancy's Sum of All Fears for this one. What if there was a third nation out there in the world who saw their own position in the world greatly improved by tricking the United States and Russia into a mutually destructive nuclear exchange?
Do you think that if Israel did such a thing, I presume you're talking about Israel, did such a thing, that they wouldn't be affected by the fallout and the worldwide collapse of everything that they import, as well as all the products that, that they need just to, that they can't make there in Israel, for instance?
Well, the question is, how much hardship are they willing to endure for a long-term outcome where Israel is a superpower? And yes, we'll use Israel, but it could be another country entirely. The thing is, it is entirely possible. We know that wars get started with false flags all the time, and we know that our leaders are willing to sacrifice segments of the population to that war in the expectation that the long-term outcome will be more positive. We know that Roosevelt willingly sacrificed all those people at Pearl Harbor to get us into World War II. We know that Woodrow Wilson sacrificed all the passengers on the Lusitania, or was willing to sacrifice all the passengers on the Lusitania to get us into World War I. This is how people at that level think. And they'll be thinking in terms of, if we do this, if we have a nuclear war with Russia, we're going to lose maybe 20% of our population, and hopefully it'll be the 20% of the population that isn't productive, the useless eaters and so forth. But that's really the way they're thinking. They don't care about individual lives of their people. It's like Stalin used to say, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic.
Oh, wow. I hadn't heard that one. Well, I think that the paradigm has changed since the advent of the nuclear bomb. So I think that, they'll reconsider starting a world war when it means that all their creature comforts and their, ability to control the multitudes into making them trillionaires is taken away in the same wars that are started, that way. So I think since World War II, we are living in a new paradigm, and it is going to be these regional wars, as much as I hate those as well,
Well, go back and look at the history of World War II, because prior to Pearl Harbor, that was viewed as a bunch of regional wars all over Europe and Asia. Same thing with World War I, which actually started between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, and somehow mutated into everybody whooping on Germany. And at some point, there's an event where everybody says, okay, the whole world is pretty much at war now. We haven't had that event for this war, but in terms of the regional conflicts, we have as many, if not more, of these already taking place around the world than were going on December 6th, 1941.
Which is fine with the regional elite as long as it doesn't go nuclear. I think that they would object to anybody, making a decision.
Well, let me give you another scenario here. What if you have these elites that you seem to think are totally in control of affairs, and they are not? They push for a conventional war, convinced that they're going to win it, and then all of a sudden they're in this conventional war, and it's turning against them. And they're looking at the choice of surrendering and losing all their creature comforts and wealth, or rolling the dice on a nuclear attack. What do you think they're going to do?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think they wouldn't like to get into that situation. They would like to control it. But
all it takes is one.
There is no. There is no making up for some crazy person going to pull the trigger on something like that. So the possibility of an accident rather than a controlled nuclear war is always there. So I agree with you there, and it is a very real possibility.
Okay. Well, thank you. We have to let you go. We're coming up on a commercial break, and we got other callers waiting on the line. We're going to do a quick little shout-out to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining our network. And when we come on back from the commercial break, we've got more callers waiting on the line about all kinds of different topics. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the telephones now with Steve Elkins, who's a fellow RBN host here. And, Steve, thank you for spending time with us today. What's on your mind?
Well, you've got some excellent calls today. You got a sharp audience out there, Michael. As far as the nuclear bomb thing here, I agree with you. I think the elitists do believe that that a nuclear war is survivable. But, you mentioned about the differences in the bomb itself, the nuclear bombs that we have today versus back in World War II, and I agree with you. We're talking apples and oranges here. These bombs that we have nowadays, very significant death and destruction, and neighboring countries on the target list would be suffering also. So I would hope that other nations who would be in that circumference of a hit zone from an enemy, supposedly, would put enough pressure to stop this insanity. But that's not what I'm calling about. I'm actually calling back that email I'd sent you on Trump to roll back Deepwater Horizon regulations. And I just wanted maybe your interpretation of this, because they talk about streaming the real-time information, the data of oil production to onshore facilities. So basically we know what's actually out there in the ocean being shipped and can be pumped in. But I also see this as possible because we're getting fudged numbers everywhere we go. Unemployment, everything is fudged numbers. I see this as a way maybe that the oil industry could also basically tell you there's a scarcity of the oil commodities, and actually just hike your prices up. What do you think about that? Maybe more of a monopoly type situation where they can tell you, yeah, we have very little oil here, but they actually have large reserves, and they know the reserves are there. But they simply jack the prices up for profit. Well, certainly, if the ability for third parties to monitor the actual volume of oil being harvested is taken away, then we're at the mercy of whatever those oil companies decide they're going to tell us. And you're absolutely right. They could say, oh, the wells aren't producing, we don't have enough of a supply, and just jack the prices up very, very high. I'm just opposed to this idea of pulling back all oversight. Most of those regulations were put in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. And the issues they were dealing with there wasn't so much the remote monitoring of oil volume, but the idea that, like, the manual blowout preventer on the Deepwater Horizon was 4 years overdue for mandatory maintenance. And in virtually every other nation that is an oil-producing nation, they mandate automated acoustic blowout preventers that listen for the blowout and shut off the pipe automatically. And the United States does not require them. It's an expensive piece of hardware, about $500,000 per well. And I thought we should have had mandated acoustic blowout preventers back when Deepwater Horizon happened. That didn't occur, and now they're pulling back on the other safety regulations that were put in. In other words, we're going down that same path of reduced regulation and oversight
that led to the Deepwater Horizon disaster itself, where you had the Minerals Management Service behaving more like they worked for the Deepwater Horizon owners and British Petroleum, rather than keeping an eye out for safety problems that threatened the local environment and population.
You know, that kind of went off the radar for a while there. How long did it take to finally cap off that well with that gusher they had? How long did that take?
That took months, and they never really succeeded in capping it all off because as a result of the pressure, the ground around the wellhead fissured, and there's actually still small amounts of oil and gas leaking out through those cracks.
Well, that's it, Michael. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for the phone call, and we're going to go ahead and start with Tom in Indiana. Aloha, Tom. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. Aloha. I watched that Skid Row Christmas 2017, watched the whole thing, saw what the guy had to say, and I went and got on Google Map, and I went up and down those streets around that area. I found the exact center where he started that video. And I went 5 blocks in any direction, and after 5 blocks, there wasn't any tents. Now, I lived out in Los Angeles for a while. I know Los Angeles is a very big city, and also in the city that I live in, I know that there's people that scam the system. He showed some of the people that scam the system, but the crux of his matter was there was a lot of money being filtered into this area to these do-good associations and stuff, and it wasn't properly used. He said that the people that ran those organizations lived in castles, but yet there wasn't anything for the people to do on the street. Well, another thing I noticed about the video, if you go look at the video, how very well kept those tents were. There wasn't anybody living, and he interviewed some of the people there and said, oh, yeah, we have a job. We're just living down here. It costs a lot to live, you know, but we're waiting to get on the dole so we can get us a $50 a month apartment and let all the taxpayers pay for it, you know. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. They have a big problem in California. All our big cities have big problems, and we do have those people. And if you've ever lived in a big city, I mean, people that rent out houses and stuff like that, we know that people scam the system. They do it all the time. And
some do. Some do. Not all of them do. Anyway, Tom, got to let you go. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Boy, that break went really, really fast. Okay, let's see. We've got another. Well, first of all, I want to respond to what Tom in Indiana said. Yeah, there are a lot of people who will scam the available social services, but I don't think that was their first choice. If we had an economy where there were plenty of jobs, good-paying jobs for the American people, and housing was affordable, food was affordable, I don't think living on the street and scamming anybody would be their first choice. And I think what some people may call scamming, others might call acts of desperation just to survive. All right, let's take ourselves another phone call. Dan in Washington, aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks. I had a point about the story in Washington State about the human trafficking yesterday, or 2 points about that. But first, I want to agree with you, though, on the scamming the social services. I think there's homeless people all over, and we don't do enough to help those who really need it and just waste billions of dollars around the world, even though some people do scam. And, you know, we don't want generational welfare, but we could definitely do more, in my opinion, to help.
Let's look at the other side of it. Everybody's trying to talk about, are the homeless people scamming the system? Some of them are. But look at the world's wealthy and how badly they scam the system. That's how they got wealthy in many cases.
Yeah, they scam it by the trillions. Homeless people, from what I see, they don't get much help at all. I mean, they got tents all over the place on underpasses now in the Seattle area and all over California, and you know, it's pretty tragic. I don't see anyone trying to help these people at all, and the mentally ill people living out there. And
well, you know, not everybody who's homeless is mentally ill or a drug addict or any of the other things. Like I said, Claire and I, when we were involved with this food distribution program at a local church, we got to see these people close up. We got to meet them and know who they are. And in a lot of cases, we were dealing with young people with brand new families that just had a streak of bad luck. And they came out here to Hawaii, they were promised jobs, and then the company that was going to hire them changed their mind or went out of business. Hawaii's dealing with its own economic hardships right now. People can get trapped on this island because it is so far away from everywhere else. And it's not uncommon to see what we call bailout piles when we drive down the street, where there'll be the entire contents of a house just out on the curb for the heavy pickup, because the people living there decided they had to get off this island, and all they had money for was the airfare, and they had to leave absolutely everything else behind. You can tell that that's what these piles represent. It's not a room renovation. It's not somebody got a new living room. These piles have debris from every single room in the house, cookware, coat hangers, everything. You just know the house has been emptied because these people felt they just couldn't stay here any longer.
Yeah, I drive trucks. I've seen that all over California, and there's people living in trailers, like at the Walmart parking lot with families. Yes. And we're in a renting bubble too. So, say the Seattle area, even 8 years ago, an apartment was say $700 a month. Now that's $1,400 a month.
Yes.
There's like nowhere for people to go. And what are you going to do? It's a horrible situation because they pumped up the housing bubble again and inflated the prices again to help out the banks and the people that already,
Yeah, they're having to inflate the price of the housing, the houses and rental units to keep their mortgages above water. And that you're right, that's done to protect the banks. And the end result is that you have the American people, the American working people, can't afford a place to live anymore. We have these stories of people up in Silicon Valley who've got very good jobs with companies like Google, and they're still having to live out of their cars.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. And I guess my point, kind of more on that now, but my point about the human trafficking, it seems like they're classifying normal prostitution as human trafficking, and then I just wanted to make the point, if they wanted to see human trafficking, they should go to, say, Eastern Washington and to an apple farm and see the bus loads of illegals and undocumented migrants all over the place. If they put a little effort into that kind of human trafficking, instead of trying to track down some guy that messaged Craigslist or whatever, it'd probably be a little more productive, I would think.
Well, they'd both be productive, but we need to remember that we're not dealing with young men and young women who just decided that since they can't get a job at Facebook, they're going to become a sex worker. We're talking about organized gangs who have persuaded young people to come to the U.S. from other countries with promises of jobs as models or something like that, and they wound up, being exploited sexually. That's what's meant by a sex trafficking ring. The young men and young women working in these sex trafficking rings did not start out intending to be sex workers, and that's why it's a much more heinous crime. As far as regular prostitution is concerned, like drugs, I really think it ought to be legalized, taxed, and regulated. And it's up to that person. If that's what they want to do with their bodies for their money, fine. But coercing somebody, trapping somebody to be a sex worker to make money off of them, that's on the same level as kidnapping, and it's a far more serious crime.
Yeah, I would agree with that part. Okay, yeah, it's horrible with the economy. It's just, I heard a statistic where the average millennial, people always give young people a hard time, like you're lazy and young people don't want to work. But I heard that the average wage of the millennial, if you count for inflation, has gone down like 30% in the past, since the 1980s even. So,
yes. Yeah, when you have to figure in the inflation before you start attempting to compare the standard of living of today's young people versus, for example, my generation. Once you figure that in, you realize that no, the standard of living for the vast majority of Americans is in decline. It's been in decline for 30 years. But the elites are doing very well. The top 0.1% gained $1 trillion in aggregate wealth this last year alone. And that is definitely a system that's out of balance.
Yeah, that banker bailout and the housing bailout with Obama and Bush and that whole thing just completely it messed everything up for probably forever. I think they just cut the standard of living in half just by doing that. It seems like, you know.
Well, the reason for the bailouts. The reason for the bailouts was very, very simple. Back when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, foreign investors were starting to get nervous about the U.S. economy. And so the U.S. government wanted to send out a message that the United States was still a safe place for investment, because if you invested your money in the U.S. and you made money, you got to keep it. But if you invested in the United States and you lost money, the taxpayers would cover the losses. So it was an all upside, no downside deal to keep foreign investment coming into this country. And the first actual demonstration of that was the savings and loan bailout. We were all told that we were going to have to bail out these S&L customers who were widows and orphan children and trust funds and the rest of it. But the vast majority of the accounts that were made good on the backs of the American taxpayer were these numbered, brokered corporate accounts for financial investment in this country. And that, of course, is absolute fascism, when those who make money get to keep their money and those who lose money dump the losses on ordinary people. And we've seen it repeated several times since then with TARP, quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, infinity. And that's the message they're sending out. The fact that it hurts the ordinary American worker is irrelevant to the idea of needing to maintain this illusion that the United States is a safe haven for foreign investment.
And for ordinary people, it just means your dollar's worth less, and then your social services get less, pretty much, right? And
and those social services are being soaked up by the refugees and the illegal immigrants.
Yeah. And one more point I'd like to make on that with Obama, that when the housing market crashed, he also let corporations start to buy houses and foreigners buy houses. And I was looking for a house at the time, and the housing prices just shot way up, way too fast. So that, you know, they were at their bottom when I bought my house, fortunately, but they just shot way back up, and now they're at insane bubble prices again, and now we're in even a rental bubble. So it didn't help the average person. I could see helping the housing market in some other way a little bit, but.
Well, the goal was to avoid the meltdown of 2008 by keeping all of the mortgages above water. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, a mortgage is considered above water if the equity value of the property exceeds the amount owed on the mortgage. If the situation reverses, if you owe more money on the mortgage than the property is worth, the mortgage is considered underwater. And when mortgages go underwater, people will voluntarily go into default. They'll walk away from it. And that was a big part of what happened back in 2008. So the reason for the rental and housing bubble is to protect the banks and the mortgage companies, yes, at the expense of the ordinary working American.
Yep, exactly. All right, thank you. Yeah, it's just that bubble is because the bubble was so high to begin with, so to bring it back up to that price, they're trying to protect that mortgage. Well, that just made it unaffordable for another generation of young people that wanted to buy houses. Now they can't. You know?
No, they can't, unfortunately. The millennial generation will not have the same lifestyle that their parents did, by and large.
Oh. And thanks for taking the call, Mike.
You got it, and we're going to switch over to Kathy in Missouri. Aloha, welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Mike. Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
Okay, great, because I'm not in a good spot. But I know people working right now full-time for wealthy business owners, and they are still on food stamps as managers, working like very, very hard as a manager. Happy, perky people. And they'd be grateful if they could get into any government, housing, but they're all full. But once you get into that government housing, you want to talk about ruthless, predatory competition. You know what I mean? The landlord can do anything they want to you once you're in there. You hear me? It's like a tragedy. So, I don't know. It's like, I know some of the people may wait up to save, but, I mean, if you're working full-time in America right now as a manager, I mean, you can't afford to even get your gas to go to work. Forget a car, all right? And I know people full-time workers right now as managers, not the underling staff, who are still on partial food stamps, and they can't afford to get to work. They have to have help. So, yeah, if anybody's, I don't think these people are scamming the system like some people think, because the computer linkage today doesn't allow the scamming to go on. You understand me? If they're willing to live out on the street like that, to wait to get into one of these, you know, most of these HUD places are godforsaken anyway. You don't want to live there.
Yes.
You hear me?
We have that here.
It's like those people have suffered so much. I don't even want to know what they've been through, why they're able to be so resilient to keep working and wait for some HUD to open, because most of these HUD places are not where you want to be.
Yeah, well, we have some of those here. In fact, we have some just down the hill and over that away, and we drive past them all the time. And, yeah, it's pretty abysmal. I think people, if they're willing to open their eyes and be objective, as they drive around their town, they're going to realize how decayed our entire society has become. Both government-supported housing, just older rental units and houses that haven't been maintained and kept up. You can see the deteriorated condition of our country, and that right there tells you we're an empire in decline. And unfortunately, our government may strike out in rage at the rest of the world in its death throes and cause a lot more damage on its way down. I remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was a big concern when the Soviet Union was collapsing, was, you know, would some Soviet leader who had a nervous breakdown as the government fell around them start turning the keys? And that was a very real concern back then, and it should be a real concern here as well.
Do you ever read that article? It was September 28th, I believe, The Guardian, Adjunct Professors Homeless. It's an excellent article, and they're working full-time, living in trailers with no heat. And one of my old pastor's wives in Dallas emailed me, and she said, well, you were wiser because you didn't go into the debt for graduate school, because I knew I couldn't pay the debt back, right?
Yes.
But I also got denied health care, but in a way it's kind of a blessing in disguise, because I've met MSWs from UW Seattle, and they were not able to move out of their crappy studio because then they had the debt load, even though they were, you know, MSW, best one in the nation, top rated. But you know what I'm saying? It's a catch-22. So, but these are academics working full-time, PhDs from Columbia even, and they're still living in, like, trailers with no heat. And so it's just tragic. And there's a gentrification going on in this underbelly of housing, and trust me, I think they'd rather have crackheads and meth whores, do you understand me, than high-functioning people who don't want to live with roaches swarming the walls. Because you know what, a PhD from might make a phone call, Mike. You know, we might want some action over here to, you know, I don't have that situation right now, but I've certainly been in a very, very, I've been in dire housing situations with absolutely, you have to lose your voice. And if you're a crackhead or a meth whore, or you just, you know, drugged out all the time, I think you can probably lose your voice a little easier than someone like myself. So, yeah, trust me, they don't want anyone high-functioning in any of the HUD housing. You know what I'm saying? They want the lower element so they can get away with whatever they want. It's very sad.
Yeah, that's definitely true. They don't want somebody who's going to come on in and start agitating for improved conditions. And I've heard all kinds of horror stories about HUD housing where you're subject to random drug searches and other such testing because of the drug problem. But it's almost like the Bill of Rights no longer applies inside the HUD housing. And now, of course, that's spreading on out to the rest of the country. With that declaration of a 100-mile Constitution-free zone around our international borders. Well, for here in Hawaii, that's the entire state, where they're out there saying now the Bill of Rights no longer applies. It's actually up to we the people where the Bill of Rights applies.
I just keep telling people, you know, just well, be good, and, you know, do the right thing, because honestly, we're in really dire situation. This is really not funny what's going on. When I'm meeting full-time workers that are half my age, that have a great attitude, no health conditions, they have no access to health care, They have nothing. They can't even afford to get to work, but they still have a great attitude. These are not whiners, okay? And they're still on partial food stamps. Imagine how I feel being the type 1 diabetic, right? You know what I mean? At 55, I'm like, oh my God,
yes.
I'm totally screwed.
Yeah, people, when they get to be our age, you know, it can be very scary out there. If all of a sudden we had to find something else to do for work, who's going to hire somebody in our age? It's a very scary situation.
Exactly.
Kathy, we got to let you go. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. And Aloha America, welcome back to our show. And Iran's parliament got together and basically voted through a bill declaring that Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. And they're saying basically this is permanent. Iran will never change its mind on that. So we're still seeing the backlash from this stunt Donald Trump pulled. And at this point, it's clear that Donald Trump has made all of his Israeli friends happy, Sheldon Adelson, Bibi Netanyahu. But in terms of our foreign policy in the Middle East, it's been thrown into disarray. And that was not a carefully considered decision on the part of Donald Trump. And if it's one thing we demand of a president, it's that they think things through. And they look at best case, worst case, middle case, before they just go along with what the cheerleaders around them are saying to do. Because this has definitely had, I think overall, this was a major foreign policy mess-up. Netanyahu was out there talking tough, saying that the region, the Middle East, needs to be mindful of Israel's superior, tremendous firepower. So he's out there issuing threats to these other countries and to Hamas. So it sounds like Netanyahu is getting ready to uncork some major battles because he's dealing with this corruption scandal. And apparently the Knesset did not pass that law making the prime minister immune from prosecution for corruption. And we're getting all these little hints being dropped by the Israeli authorities saying that there are some new revelations to come as to just how bad Netanyahu's corruption has been all this time. So Netanyahu may be looking at not being in office much longer, and he may think that a nice war with Iran might distract everybody away from that. You can't change leaders in the middle of a war. Just accept the corruption as part of the price of defeating Iran or Hamas or whoever. And the fact that the United States government would gladly leap in on Israel's side in a war against Iran, well, that's just a little side benefit as well. Now, we're seeing this rhetoric cranking up again about North Korea. Newsweek came on out with a particular piece of Beck's, how North Korea would wage war against the U.S., and Newsweek is out there saying that obviously North Korea will not attack the U.S. directly out of fear of nuclear retaliation. But then Newsweek goes on to say that North Korea might display their ire at the United States government by attacking South Korea or possibly Japan. And they're in there, Newsweek is just saying North Korea launching war. But it's very obvious it is the U.S. that wants war with North Korea, or at least is building up to the threat of war against North Korea. North Korea wants to be left alone, and that is why they're building weapons of deterrence rather than weapons of invasion. But there's a new insight into this coming out from truthout.org. And this goes all the way back to Dick Cheney and the neocons. And basically it says that North Korea had actually reached agreements with both the Clinton and George W. Bush administrations that would have bypassed this whole buildup of weapons and missiles. But Dick Cheney and his friends destroyed those deals in order to sell the idea that the United States needs to build a new ballistic missile defense system. Star Wars 2. And all the contractors will make huge amounts of money. All right, we're going to take a break for station identification. We're going to be back here with Donald Jeffries after these few words. Aloha America, welcome back to our show, hour number 3, and joining us for this hour is author Donald Jeffries, and he's written a book called Survival of the Richest. It's out on Amazon, a couple of other places like Skyhorse Publishing. And Donald, thank you for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Okay, so just to get right on into it, tell us about the book, why did you write it, and what is it really all about?
Well, it examines what I think is the most important issue in America today, and that's the disparity of wealth, the fact that our wealth has been transferred upwards over the last 30 years or so into the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. I think it's the most important issue. Obviously, the right is not going to address this issue, and the left surprisingly steers away from it. I mean, Bernie Sanders types draw attention once in a while to a living wage and so forth, but they don't tackle the big issue, which is I think this is a populist issue, and that's what I'm a populist. So this is not your conventional left-wing attack on the rich. It's a populist theme thing where I don't like concentration of power in the hands of too few people, and I think we clearly have that today in terms of wealth.
Yeah, there's no question about it. And as we've seen with George Soros, people with huge amounts of money seem to feel that gives them a right to mess around with the planet and its people like it's a personal toy. And we ought to be cautious because, of course, these individuals absolutely were not elected to have this kind of power and authority over us.
No, absolutely not. And with power, the wealth comes great power. I mean, there's that old expression, affluence means influence, and that's what you have today. You can't have a first world economy, I don't believe, with the kind of disparity of wealth we have. And just since I've written the book, I mean, the book has been out for several months, but I completed it basically a couple of years ago, and the statistics have grown worse since then. I mean, I just read one last week where it came out with that 50% of Americans, the bottom half of this country, make $27,000 or less a year. That's almost impossible for me to believe because anywhere in this country, you're in Hawaii, you know what the cost of living is there, but in most parts of the country, unless maybe a few places in Mississippi, Arkansas like that, perhaps you might be able to get a one-bedroom apartment or something on a salary like that, and that's $27,000. That's $27,000 or less. I don't believe that you can have a first world nation with that kind of disparity of wealth. Half your country already, 50%, has less than 1% of the collective wealth. Basically, half the country has nothing, and which each wave of immigration, whether it's legal or largely illegal, all those people are entering at the bottom of the economic ladder, and they're just simply dragging the numbers down even further because they're desperately poor. So obviously they're going to wind up at the bottom. They're not bringing any wealth into the country.
Well, that's been a big problem for quite some time in that going back 30 years when our manufacturing started to decline in terms of both quantity and quality, less wealth was coming into the country from outside. We have $1.5 billion a day trade deficit because American consumers are living off of these imported products made in factories in other countries. And so there have been attempts to try and make it look like this is okay. In the 1980s, they had the so-called service economy, where the idea was we could make our nation prosper by doing each other's laundry for a fee. But anybody will tell you that if you're going to have a strong functioning economy, you have to have the general population engaged in the growing of or manufacturing of products or services that can be sold to other countries to balance the trade deficit. And because of the way our banking system is structured, no matter how hard people work, the more and more share of the product of their work is siphoned off by the banking system. And you're absolutely right. It is hideously out of control right now. If you go back and you look at the history of countries hovering on the edge of revolution, you will see that they were in periods of tremendous wealth inequality. A good example would be the France before their revolution or the United States under King George III's Currency Act. And I'm not advocating revolution, but I'm saying it is a symptom that has to be looked at.
No, and John F. Kennedy, famously said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And that's the situation where we're going to come to at some point, because sooner or later, it's going to be, when I don't know what the critical mass will be, when it's 60-70% of the people have less than 1% of the collective wealth. I don't know what that would be, but the problem is everyone who's in a position of influence at all that has a public platform, except writers like me that are trying to reach hopefully a bigger audience. But anyone on television, most of your celebrities, obviously they're all in the 1%. So the system is working great for them.
Yes.
And they have no reason to protest. And it's the people that are out there, the people that I've talked to, the college graduates that can't get a job. We're talking about, and this tax plan that just passed is just going to make things worse. One of the deductions they eliminated was the deduction for student loans. The average student loan in America now is $32,000. And that's just incredible. And these kids are the ones that are going to school now. That's looking at the bigger picture. Only 11% of college graduates come from that bottom income quartile. The poor people don't go to college. And most people don't realize that when they talk about education, and they make these little sound bites to that effect. I mean, who's not in favor of education? The problem is at this point, college is not a good deal, and it really only caters to the people that are in that top 20%, or maybe if you stretch it to the top 50% to one degree or another. But the people in that lower end of that top 50% tend to getting jobs. First of all, they usually have to get the student loans. They're saddled with tremendous debt. I mean, I work with someone who's still paying off a student loan. He's in his 50s. Goes back that far, and he has a decent job. But if you have a $50,000 student loan or something, and you get a job coming out of college making $30,000, do the math. I mean, is that worth it? And how long will it take you to pay that off? So I think that's the subject we have to explore. And then you mentioned trade. That's the other big thing, and it certainly was one of the main attractions I believe Trump had to populists like me. He's the first one that actually talked about the disastrous trade deals. But we still have all those people that used to work in the factories that didn't go to college but had decent jobs. They had strong unions, and even without strong unions, the presence of unions lifted all the wages up. They made decent lives for themselves, and those kinds of people still exist. If everyone goes to college, the value of each college diploma obviously plummets. So we have to have people out there that can make a living as they once did in factories. We need to start building something. We need to have some kind of production in this country. And as you mentioned, we're a service economy. We can't just keep, washing each other's cars, whatever.
Well, the problem with modern education is it's more about indoctrination, and we hear about all these snowflakes with their little bubble wrap and their trigger words and everything, and you realize that the colleges, even with all the student loans, are not really preparing these young people for the real world, either in terms of job skills or their ability to deal with the adversity that you're going to encounter as you get out into the job market and the corporate race. And these kids are not prepared for it. What are they going to do the first time they come up against somebody who's competing for the same promotion they are? Just break down and cry and say, you're discriminating against me? School has been turned into a racket, like so many other things in this country. It's not about education anymore. It's just another way to take young people and plunge them on that debt hook as early and as hard as possible and keep them there for the rest of their lives.
Oh yeah, exactly. And not only have the debt, as you mentioned, they're not learning much of anything. And that's in my first book, Hidden History, one of the problems I've run into trying to talk to, especially young people, is that Americans largely are historically illiterate, as I'm sure you probably know, but young people especially are, because they don't learn any real history in school. They learn a few sound bites, the kind of things that we see on television. They don't learn any, and obviously they don't know math. They don't learn much of any value, but they do get lots of social indoctrination, the social justice warrior type of stuff.
Yes.
And they learn about transgender bathrooms and nonsense like that. And that's why the left is so, I am, this book is about as far left-wing as it could be, but I really don't like the conventional leftists today, because they're all wrapped up in that social justice warrior type of stuff. And that's where people like me are caught. We're caught in the middle between those social justice kind of authoritarians that want to shut down free speech, want to get people fired over the slip of the tongue, and then the right wing, which is just sold on the Ayn Rand philosophy of, don't love your neighbor, and just pure greed and how much profit can I make, and, he who dies with the most toys wins, looking out for number one. So I don't know, where there is a place anymore for an old-fashioned classic liberal or certainly a populist in today's world, but I think that's what we need if we're going to make life as good as we possibly can for as many people as we possibly can.
Well, I'm in agreement with you on that one, and that's why I like to describe myself as a paleocon, which goes back to the original principles of conservatism, which meant limited government, and you're there to just create a climate in which people can, if they choose, better themselves through work and education. But today we have the liberals that are trying to follow along with this idea that they want to engineer a society around us, and through that engineered society, engineer what we think and what we know. One of the biggest failings I see in modern education, and this is at all levels, not just colleges and universities, but especially down in the grade school levels, the one thing they are not teaching kids to do is how to think and analyze critically, rationally. And it's all about belief. It's believing in the soundbite. And so education, along with all of its other failings, it's turned into a big lie, because these kids are getting these degrees for something like art history major or whatnot, and they walk out of that graduation thinking they're educated and they know what's going on. And they don't. They just have a head that's filled with all the propaganda that they borrowed money to have fed to them over the preceding years.
Yeah, and it's all about your feelings. How does that make you feel? And, that's kind of the politics of feeling. And we saw that with the election of Trump, where, you had the students basically shut down, and they were handing them coloring books. I mean, things that, looked like onion stories to me. I could not even believe that was real, but it was all because of what they were feeling, and obviously they were indoctrinated to the media. And it's so much of this problem is also the way that the major media reports things. I mean, for instance, they kind of allude to, I can get lots of my stories for Survival of the Richest off of sites like Huffington Post and so forth, but they don't approach the subject the way I do, where they don't look at it, okay, like, what is the value? Why, for instance, if the marketplace, is such a sacred thing, certainly to conservatives, then why do golden umbrellas exist? Why does the Carly Fiorina get a $40 million golden umbrella? That's more money than most people earn in a lifetime. To leave Hewlett-Packard after she ran them to the ground. And that's just, I'm using her as an example because then she somehow felt qualified to run for president of the United States afterwards, after doing that bang-up job. But we see this over and over again. We recently saw it in the NFL, like a guy like Roger Goodell, who, like so many of these guys, didn't build anything. His father was a United States senator. That put him in a position to succeed. He's been awful. He's killed a corporate entity I did not think could be killed. The NFL is on life support now and it's largely because the person leading it is not getting, approaching this from a rational point of view. Okay, well, we've offended the fans, whether you like it or not. We've offended them. We have to do something to address that. They're not doing that. They're planting their feet in and becoming more stupid by the minute. And he actually told, hey, look, you got to raise my salary and give my family free health insurance for life. And they acceded instead of saying, no, you've done a horrible job. We'll bring someone else in. Nope. They acceded to it. And that's what happens is that we see this over and over again, but these are the same people that say that, if we raise the minimum wage, the prices will go up. Somehow they don't go up with the $40 million umbrellas or the tremendous bonuses we see. And as I quote in the book several times, including the banks that we bailed out, I believe 6 of the banks that we bailed out in 2008 had more money paid out in bonuses that year than the company made in profits. I don't know how that can possibly even be. There's certainly not a business model, and it certainly doesn't reflect any kind of true capitalism. And we see it over and over again, and that's what I talk about in the book, is that this is what we have is crony capitalism. We don't have free enterprise. We have kind of a plutocracy. And it's more of a fascism, where you have the merger of government, because we see so many perks, corporate welfare that the government gives, especially with the NFL owners. How many times we see the stadiums being built by taxpayer funds and so forth. This is the kind of thing we see. Capitalism, fascism, I believe, can be defined as a merger between corporate and government power, and I think that's what we see, and that's the way I'm approaching this issue. And I think people need to look at it that way, because wealth is a finite thing, and we have to have it not trickle down, but people have to be able to purchase things, buy things, so that businesses can, you can sell whatever products we're importing, but we're still here selling them. You have to have some kind of ability for your citizens to be able to engage in your economy. And right now we have half of the population basically has nothing, and I don't see how you can continue without the economy crumbling.
Well, you put everybody on credit. The retailers are claiming they've had a good holiday shopping season. and the corporate media is trumpeting. It's another indicator that the economy is turning around. But the vast majority of the holiday shopping was done on credit cards, and to my mind, that's made things a lot worse. Now, I'm fully in agreement with you that we are not a capitalist nation any longer, that we have gone down the path to fascism. And by the way, that comment about fascism being a merger of government and corporate interests against the general population, that goes all the way back to Benito Mussolini, who I'm sure we all understand won the Olympic gold medal for being a fascist jerk. But he's absolutely right. We are a fascistic economic system, and one of the symptoms that we see of it is that apparent incompetence, if not criminal people, seem to get incentivized. They get bailed out, they get golden parachutes, they get amazing retirement deals even when they do a horrible job. I'm in agreement with you of this Carly Fiorina, what she did to Hewlett-Packard, because I'm old enough to remember when Hewlett-Packard really meant something. It really was one of the best American companies. I was introduced to their equipment when I worked for NASA all those years ago, and I've had Hewlett-Packard calculators throughout my career. And then when my wife and I started a company here on Oahu, because of my past relationship with Hewlett-Packard, we bought all HP equipment for our shop, and it all started failing like crazy. And I hadn't realized that Carly Fiorini, when she'd taken over Hewlett-Packard, had changed all their supply chains to just go with the cheapest available components they could find, slap an HP logo on it, and put it in the store. It's almost a lot like the storyline from Michael Crichton's Disclosure. If you go back and you read that. And it was a warning that this rush toward profit above all else was leading to a situation in which the very best American companies were being taken over and simply exploited for their name to put out absolute junk. And at this point, I'm never going to buy a Hewlett-Packard product again after getting burned that badly.
Yeah, and I think we see that kind of corporate mindset in someone like a Paul Ryan. I think reflects it perfectly, because these guys are disciples of Ayn Rand, and it's the greed is good mentality. It's what was spoofed in the movie Wall Street.
Yes.
But it's become mainstream now, and just it's profit for its own sake. That's all that matters. Now, the old line capitalists, even the old the old robber barons, going back that far, at least most of them founded their own companies. So they had a first-generation interest in that company. And you look at somebody like a Henry Ford, who was, violently anti-union, but he famously raised his workers' wages, and all the other, kind of barons said, well, why'd you do that? And he said, well, I have to pay him enough to be able to afford the car. And that's what nobody sees. The people today that are running things, they don't think that. When they don't give their workers a raise every year, the cost of living continues to raise. I mean, these people, it used to be, I can remember when those of us would, complain about only getting a 3% cost of living raise. Most of us would love to get that now. But instead, you had the people at the top getting huge bonuses every year. Most of the workers below them get nothing, or don't even get a yearly raise, let alone a bonus. And it's that kind of dichotomy between what's happening with the perks and the benefits and the raises, and we've seen it again, especially since the 80s. What has happened with the union? The power of unions kind of going down to virtually nothing now, and therefore they're in with the impact of immigration at the other end, and that's another place I obviously disagree with most people on the left, because most people on the left kind of turn their back on immigration and act like it hasn't had a huge impact on wages, when it's probably had more of an impact on anything else than blue-collar wages. And that's why, again, Trump was so promising when he talked about doing something about it. But I was just reading where AT&T, who got some good press a few weeks ago for giving a $1,000 bonus to $200,000 workers. Well, now it turns out they're laying off people left and right. And it came a story today how they're laying off 600 or 700 workers and replacing them with H-1B visa workers. And I wrote a lot about that program. There's no reason in the world for it to exist. And Trump criticized it rightfully during his campaign, but he didn't cancel the program. He's made a few modifications that supposedly make it harder for spouses to come over something, but the program still exists. I think that would have been a great symbolic gesture to just get rid of it, because you can get rid of it with a stroke of a pen, and there's no reason for it. When you have 90 to 100 million of Americans of adult age out of work, it's crazy to be laying off people that have jobs and bringing these people in to replace them.
Well, you're absolutely right. Now, Donald, we're going to have to take a break here for some commercials, and we'll be back with Donald Jeffries, author of Survival of the Richest, after these few words. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Donald Jeffries, author of Survival of the Richest. And, Don, I want to step back here to something that you talked about when you mentioned in the age of the robber barons, these were people who started their own companies, and they had an attachment to them, at least for the first generation. And that was an important factor because, again, back then, along with being emotionally connected to the creation of the company, people started businesses to be in business, not to try and build them up and then sell them out real quickly. And more importantly, there was a very tragic phenomenon that happened at the close of World War II, because the United States came out of World War II in a tremendously advantageous position. We were the only industrialized nation that still had its industrial base intact. All the other industrialized nations had had their factories bombed into rubble. And so there was this golden age where other nations that were trying to rebuild their factories had to come to the United States and buy machine tools, ball bearings, various other things. It was a boom time for American companies. And there quickly developed a crisis, because these companies that were making all of these products to send on out to the rest of the world, they couldn't afford to promote their workers on the floor into new management positions as these businesses grew, because these were the guys who knew how it all actually worked. And so Harvard Business School decided to come up with a new theory of mid-level management called scientific management, and they developed a set of tools that supposedly could apply to any business engaged in any kind of activity, and then they created a degree program to go with it, the Masters of Business Administration, or the MBA. And Harvard's thinking was that somebody with an MBA could be working at a car factory this week and be doing a good job as a mid-level manager, and then a month down the road they could be working in pharmaceuticals, and a month down the road they could be working at a bread factory. And it did work and fill the levels of mid-management over the rapidly expanding American industrial output. The problem is it created a generation of mid-level managers who did not have that emotional connection to the business, had no respect for the actual process of making whatever product was being sold. And those mid-level managers post-World War II are now the corporate leaders of our industry today. And they still have zero connection emotionally to what's actually being made on the floor. And that's why it's very easy for them to go along with debasing the quality of the product, or even worse, offshoring the manufacturing to other countries that are manufacturing powerhouses like China, and just say, we'll let them deal with the grease under the fingernails. All we need to do is manage the money and the supply chain. And so one of the worst things that really happened followed the tech boom of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, all of that was born in the Apollo moon program. In solving those problems of getting to the moon and back, the U.S. invented all kinds of new materials, new technologies, integrated circuits, things that we take for granted today just didn't exist before Apollo. And a lot of new companies started out making products with those new technologies, but for the most part, the holders of those licenses simply licensed other countries to make those products. So the job creation that came out of this technology funded by the U.S. taxpayer wound up being in other countries like China, like Taiwan, like South Korea. And those countries are not going to be dumb enough to let it come back here very, very easily. And so for the last 30 years, our manufacturing domestically has been in a decline in quantity and quality. And topping that off, of course, the rest of the world does not want our GMO agriculture. And that's why we're in a real mess. And it seems like, and your book seems to reinforce the idea, that the wealthy in the United States are just totally focused on grabbing as much of what remains of the nation's wealth to themselves before it all starts coming apart.
Oh, I certainly agree with all that, and you're right. I think it is really as simple as that. It's a kind of a caricature of the rich to think that they're just, they're greedy. But I really think the 1% at least, especially the top 1% of the 1%, the people at the very top that have just an incredible amount of wealth, I think that's all they're consumed with, is just maintaining that. That's why you hear so many stories about, Bill Gates going out and not even tipping 15% of the time, half the time. I mean, this is the world's, I guess Jeff Bezos is the richest guy now, but until recently, Gates had been number one for a long time. So if the richest man in the world can't give a waitress a decent tip, I don't know what kind of world, but that's the kind of mentality they have. And then of course you have people on the right that just say, well, that's how he got his money. It's like, okay, yeah, that's how he. But,
well, not exactly, but having money is actually addictive. And there was a documentary that came out called Inside Job some years ago. It won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Documentary, looking at the 2008 mortgage-backed security fraud meltdown. And one of the things they had in this documentary is that scientists actually wired up the brains of Wall Street traders, and they discovered that when they made a big score, when the number in their portfolio jumped up by another zero, they got this intense rush of pure pleasure from the exact same center of the brain that responds to the use of cocaine. And it's from this physical process. They're literally an addictive process. They're money junkies, and you get behavior like the Wolf of Wall Street. We've got to take another break for commercials. I know our commercial breaks are kind of skewed crooked here, but when we come on back, we'll have about a good quarter of an hour to talk uninterrupted. We'll be right back. Aloha America, welcome back to our show here. We're talking with Donald Jeffries, author of Survival of the Richest. And Donald, let's talk about the book itself. And by the way, I've posted a link from whatreallyhappened.com to one of the many venues where you can buy the book for yourself. Give us an overview of the book itself, the contents, what's in it.
Well, again, the subtitle is How the Disparity of Wealth and the Corruption of the Marketplace Created the Greatest Conspiracy of All. And I do think it's the greatest conspiracy of all. We talk a lot about class envy, and that's invariably what you get from conservatives when someone starts talking about, raising the pay of workers and we're not getting paid enough. Well, that's just class envy. Well, it is class envy because, when half of the country has nothing and you have so few people that having that, with these trust fund babies and people like that. I had a chapter in the book that was deleted because for length reasons, where I went into the backgrounds of so many celebrities and so many corporate leaders and just looked into their backgrounds, and I could find barely any, and I'm talking about past and present. I went back to the golden age of Hollywood. Almost all of them came from at least upper middle class backgrounds. And my point was that, you have to, you just have an innate advantage. Wealth gives you an advantage, and we see it from the glaring statistics about it. It's 43% of the people that are born in the lowest quadrille economically never move out of that quadrille. They never move up at all, and 70% never even make it to the middle. And that's the reality that we face. It's very hard. I mean, we can look at these depressed areas and then come up with lots of reasons culturally, perhaps why they stay that way. But money is very important, and I don't think anybody has looked at the subject as I do. I mean, I analyze various occupations, why they pay what they pay, why, for instance, someone being a vice president, I call it vice president in charge of looking out the window. Corporate America is filled with these vice presidents in charge of looking out the window. And they say anybody can do whatever menial job. Anybody can clean the toilets. Anybody can mop the floors. Well, yeah, anybody could, theoretically, but the fact that nobody wants to, it's clearly harder work if you just look at physical labor. And, why can't we say that anybody could be one of these vice presidents? Because in today's corporate America, they are largely just yes men or yes women. They go to meetings and they agree to whatever the CEO says, and that way they get their own fat bonus at the end. So they have obviously a vested interest in agreeing. But my point would be, how many citizens couldn't do that? How many people couldn't be good yes men or women? So when they demean the physical labor, especially, and say anybody could do that, yeah, anybody can do that, I suppose, as long as you're physically capable of it. But that's, I think, a large subtext of my book is trying to show that, all work should be appreciated. And at one point, I mean, I remember back in the 1960s and 1970s, any kind of work, any kind of job, work at a gas station. I mean, I knew one of my favorite talking points is, I knew someone that was a cashier at Safeway back in the early 80s, was making $35,000 a year then. It was a good union job. Fast forward to today, and that same cashier is making less than $8 an hour at the same company. Something's wrong with a marketplace like that. What happened? Why was that considered a really mainstream job that was very respected by everyone. And someone who had a job like that or worked at Sears, Montgomery Ward's, a lot of the stores that are out of business or largely gone out of business, just worked, behind a counter in retail, could raise a family, could buy a house. Their wife didn't have to work if she didn't want to, and they could have as many children as they wanted to. Something has happened dramatically in the 50 years since then, because obviously that's not the case now. In most cases, both husband and wife have to work. In many cases, you're limited to the kind of quintessential 2 children. And we're always struggling with debt, and 72% of Americans, I believe in the latest poll, live paycheck to paycheck. So I think we need to look at that, but no one wants to look at the picture like that. Instead, it's, okay, let's just raise the minimum wage, which is fine. Okay, but let's look at why the workers that have been at a job 10 years, 15 years, why they're not making more money. There's no room for advancement. They run up against, we talk about the glass ceilings for women or other groups. There's a glass ceiling for workers at almost every job where you just simply don't get raises. And people don't talk about that because it wasn't that way. As recently as 40 years ago, really up until maybe the 80s, any job, you could at least, go rent an apartment, but when half your country is making $27,000 or less in today's dollars, obviously half the country is going to struggle even to go rent a one-bedroom apartment. I think it's just important to look at these issues, and I don't think anyone else is doing that.
Well, one of the factors that we talk about on our show all the time is that for an economy to perpetuate, to continue to function, there has to be a method of recycling accumulated wealth at the top and bring it back down to the bottom as decent wages and salaries, so that ordinary working people, middle-class people, can trade their labors and skills for those decent wages of salaries and then pump that money back into the system to keep commerce going. Prior to the 2008 meltdown of the mortgage-backed security fraud, consumerism accounted for 60% of the U.S. economy. It's nowhere near that anymore, and I'm not sure I'm ready to believe the glorious pronouncements about what a wonderful holiday shopping season we've had this last year. And there's a tremendous short-sightedness with the money junkies in that they seem to have forgotten a simple idea that if you're not allowing workers to earn the money to buy the products you're selling, you're not going to sell those products. You mentioned Henry Ford before. One of the things that he said that I always agreed with is that the best way to become prosperous is to make your community around you prosper. And that was part of the thinking of his paying his workers enough where they could afford to buy the cars they were building. And they became his best advertisement because Ford's entire sales pitch was a car that ordinary workers can afford. Because Henry Ford didn't invent the car. There were already cars all over, but they were rich people's playthings. Daimler Benz and so forth and so on. Ford wanted to popularize the automobile as something for ordinary workers, and paying his employees enough to buy those cars was his most powerful advertising device. And he proved he was right. It was absolutely right. The richer the workers are around you, the more of your product they can buy.
Yeah, it seems to be a simple concept, doesn't it? But it seems to be lost, as you mentioned, short-sightedness, and I think that's what we see in all our leadership today, whether it's government and certainly corporate leadership. There's just an incredible short-sightedness. There's no visionary thinkers out there at all. It's all about, how much is my bonus going to be this Christmas? Really, that's about the extent of their thinking. They lay off, 10,000 workers at the drop of a hat. We've seen that so often. I talk a lot about that in Survival of the Richest, how these layoffs occur in the midst of company prosperity, of record bonuses for the same company, and often their bonuses increase with the number of layoffs. You lay off that many more, but hey, look what you saved the company money. Well, you saved the company money, but you threw thousands of families into turmoil. You created who knows how many divorces and suicides by doing something like that. And yet a lot of these fine folk will still look in the mirror. They'll be able to look at themselves. They'll go to church on Sunday, and they'll call themselves Christians. And it just amazes me that there's no broad thinking and looking at the big picture. Okay, you have to have people, Americans, I believe, in American leadership, I certainly, studying history, I'm not a fan of many of our past leaders, but at least they recognized, as Henry Ford did, that they weren't quite as greedy, and they didn't call themselves CEOs, I don't believe, until the 80s. I think that was a term that really started being popularized then. But many times it was the company president and even founder that ran the company, and they tended to share, at least to some degree, to have the workers share in their wealth. And we did not see the incredible disparity we see now between CEO pay, executive pay, and worker pay. Back then it was much closer. And so you didn't feel quite as disconnected. You felt that the guy was still a human being. It's like attending an athletic event now, where in the past, again, up until maybe the 50s or 60s, a lot of these ball players had jobs in the off season, and they were you could relate to them as average Joes. They lived in a lot of the same neighborhoods that the fans did. Now they're living in sheltered mansions. They're if you're a baseball, basketball player, every one of those millions that you signed for is fully guaranteed, unlike football. So the average fan cannot relate to them, and I think that's another aspect that is ignored of why the NFL, in particular, is seeing its ratings and attendance plummet, because the fans can't relate to people that are in that position. These are all one percenters, and for them to be claiming that they're oppressed or something is the height of ridiculousness.
Well, this gets back to what you were saying about the descent into fascism, because the people who are in these positions of top management have had a paradigm shift. They don't care about the company. They don't care about the product. They're there to make themselves extremely rich, and so the focus has shifted away from running a company well and producing a quality product into simply gaming the system to make sure more money is just flowing toward you. Having government force people to buy the product that you're selling that's not very good, various things like that. And once you get into an environment like that, once you have a government that goes along with that, it's very easy for top management to say, why should I work at making a quality product? As long as the government isn't going to arrest us for putting out dangerous, toxic products, let's just maximize our profitability. I look at that huge stink that they had with the Bayer company some years ago, where it was discovered their blood clotting factor for hemophiliacs was tainted with the HIV virus. And Bayer had to stop selling it in the United States, but instead of destroying this dangerous product, they simply sold it overseas to countries that didn't have any laws protecting the consumer. And a lot of people got AIDS, but Bayer managed to sell the product and not have to take the loss of destroying it all. And that kind of mindset appears to be acceptable behavior among the elites themselves and among the government as well. The attitude these days seems to be, as long as it makes money, it's okay. And that's why we have these government-mandated vaccines, talk about forcing people to buy a product they don't want and don't need. We find out the vaccines are completely ineffective. In some cases, they're harmful. But again, when you're in that model from the vaccine maker's point of view, your stockholders are going to be happy if you just go along with that and they make their money. And it does get back to the reality that money is an addiction.
Yeah, and sure. You create a vaccine. What did Bill Gates' foundation had a vaccine in India that I think caused, I don't know how many thousands of cases of paralysis right away, but it's just, people just kind of shrug that off. It's still a good thing. Well, I don't know how that's a good thing, but
we meant well. That's what they think. We meant well. We had good intentions. Therefore, we're off the hook on this. But in terms of Bill Gates and vaccines, he sees it as a world depopulation mechanism. Now, we have a caller waiting on the line. I don't know if she has a question for you or for me. Lee from Mount Shasta, California. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi. Well, the main thing is that a few days back, I guess I heard about the executive order signed December the 17th about blocking the property of persons involved in serious human rights abuse or corruption. And I hadn't heard it. There was several sites on the internet talking about this, but I haven't heard anything like on Fox News.
Well, I don't know that the corporate media is going to cover it. I mean, we covered it briefly yesterday. The big question, the big issue is apparently the way this executive order is written, it could be applied to everybody who partook of the Uranium One deal, which as time goes by seems to be almost everybody inside the Beltway. The big question is, will it actually be enforced? Because just because the president signs an executive order doesn't guarantee it will be carried out. And a good example of that, of course, would be the executive order signed by President John F. Kennedy that stripped covert paramilitary operations away from the Central Intelligence Agency and handed them to the Pentagon. This was in keeping with Kennedy's professed desire to shatter the CIA and scatter them to the wind. But the EO was never carried on out because the bureaucracy liked things the way it was going, and of course Kennedy was eventually removed. Do you have a question specific for survival of the richest for Donald?
No, I just happened to call. I didn't know I can't listen to your show live. I normally listen to it the next day.
Okay.
And I just thought, well, I'll see if I can get through.
Well, you got through, and thank you very much for the phone call. We're going to let you go. Now, turning on back here to Donald, does your book make any, shall we say, recommendations for things that could correct our current system?
Well, the first thing I think that should be done, and I think no one would object to this, is that they ought to go back to the Grace Commission in the 1980s. One of the things that Reagan, in his quest to downsize government, which he didn't do at all, he had a Grace Commission that was formed, and they appear, unlike most commissions, to have done a pretty good job. And they determined at that time that fully 1/3 of all government spending is absolute 100% waste and could be eliminated without affecting a single program. Now, I can't imagine that it hasn't gone up since then, but even if it's still only 1/3, I don't know who could possibly object to cutting spending by 1/3 and cutting taxes therefore by 1/3. So I would start there, because I think if that right there would cut at least 1/3 out if you got rid of the waste. And I understand that, so many people are profiting from the waste, fraud, and abuse that we see. But, they didn't recognize it at the time, and Reagan is one of the many things he didn't do that he should have done based on his rhetoric. He basically ignored the conclusions of the Grace Commission. I would go with that. And that was the first thing I would do. And then I would look at things like Social Security. To save the Social Security fund, I would start strictly means testing, and as Ross Perot suggested, at voluntary means testing back in 1992, and he was shouted down by the old folks lobby very quickly, and he went back into his shell. And I would also tax all Social Security income. Most people don't realize what a regressive tax Social Security tax is. Only the first $119,000 of income is taxed. So Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, people like that, are paying taxes on $119,000 income for purposes of Social Security. So things like that, I think, could save the Social Security fund. And of course, it's been corrupted by being commingled with all the funds going back to LBJ, and then Reagan really did it when he raised Social Security taxes. But I think those things at least would address those problems. I think Social Security could be saved if those recommendations were made. And I think we need to end something like the H-1B visa programs. All visa worker programs should be ended. There's no need for them when you have 90 to 100 million Americans out of work. That needs to be done.
Now, I'm in agreement with you on that one, but playing devil's advocate, one of the reasons why I think companies go for the H-1B visa program employees, it's not just that they are willing to accept lower pay. It's unfortunately, tragically, they're better educated. And this goes back to what we were saying about education, where it's all about indoctrination rather than education. And most of the people coming out of high school or even college don't really have competitive levels of job skills with these people who are educated in other countries. We've got to take one more break for commercials. We'll be back with the last segment of our program after these few words. Hi, America. Welcome back to our show. Last segment of our program today here. We're talking with Donald Jeffries, author of Survival of the Richest. And Donald, I was looking through the email during the commercial break, and I've got some requests. Do you have a website that lists all of your books and all of your articles? I'm not talking about a sales website, but your personal web page where people can find out more about you, possibly send you an email.
Yeah, I blog regularly. My blog is called Keeping It Unreal, after my novel, the 2007 novel, The Unreals. You can find it at donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. Again, I blog pretty regularly there, and I talk about my books. I mean, I've had 3 books published, and so they can find out everything they need to do there. Okay, and I've got it up here, and I will link to this from whatreallyhappened.com. All right, so Donald, we got about 3.5, 4 minutes left here. What else do you want to share with us from the book? Well, again, I think it's important. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people that are going through. I've heard so many heart-wrenching stories on what people have gone through. People that have been thrown out of work in their 50s, even 60s. Retirement has become another thing that most Americans are just not going to be able to enjoy. Again, 20, 30 years ago, most Americans did have pensions, and Social Security was more indexed a lot closer to the cost of living than it is now. But I think that it's a subject that it really is going to impact everyone. It's going to impact more and more every year unless the economy really turns around, unless Trump was telling the truth about bringing industry back, if he can actually get factories back and we can start and industries back again, which I don't know, it may be too late for that, but we're looking at things like artificial intelligence taking millions of jobs. We don't know what kind of impact that's going to have. And our leaders are never been known for their foresight, and they're certainly not looking at that logically either. They're saying, oh, that's great. Truckers, we're going to have 10 million truckers going to lose their jobs to self-driving trucks. Well, what's the impact on those 10 million truckers? We don't think of that. And where are they going to go? Into an economy where you already have a glut from immigration, from foreign visa workers, from people just cutting back and top-heavy management and trying to get as much as they can out of workers at the bottom. We see this over and over again. The old expression, so many of these golden chestnuts, like too many chiefs, not enough Indians, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. They're becoming so obvious now, and more obvious than they've been to me in my lifetime. But I would suggest that as people near retirement age and anyone who's been thrown out of work in this economy and has tried to find a job, especially if they've been kind of stagnant, as a lot of us are, if they've been in their position, say, 15, 20 years, and that happens to a lot of people. Suddenly the company goes out of business, or they just decide to downsize, and a lot of times they actually lay off the people that are most senior in status, because seniority has no benefits anymore, and because they're paid more, their benefits are better, so it behooves them to bring in cheaper labor. It's those people trying to find jobs out there in this market. I've had so many people, whose their eyes have been open. They say, yeah, I'm glad somebody's finally talking about this. So I think anybody who's a part of this economy should read the book.
Well, Donald, we're out of time here. There's the music. I'm going to tell you right now, I want to have you back on the show in the very near future because I still have a ton of questions I wanted to ask you, and it is an important issue. We are a fascist economic dictatorship. All right, that's the end of our program. Please stay tuned for John Stedmiller. He's got a lot of interesting things to share with you. Go to whatreallyhappened.com. I've put links to where you can buy Donald Jeffries' book. I just put up the link to his blog spot so you can get in touch with him with your questions. We'll have him back here in the future. So we'll talk to you tomorrow, Friday. Aloha, America.